Okay, so let's review some of the previous videos that we've had. We had a video that showed how to draw chemical structures, right? So learning how to draw skeletal structures. So that was this worksheet. We had a worksheet that reminded us how to go from skeletal structures to condensed structures. Again, not something we generally do in formalism, but it's a way for us to make sure that we recognize what the atoms are that are not explicitly drawn in a skeletal structure. And then our first sample problem from the textbook actually looked at drawing different isomers of hydrocarbons. And we want to be able to do this using skeletal structures because that's going to be the fastest way to do that. So skills that we need for chapter 15 are kind of drawing Lewis structures. So making sure that we can start with a correct structure. And then after we have a correct structure, be able to draw it as a skeletal structure. And then beyond that, we need to think about functional groups. So functional groups, again, are a group of atoms that tends to have specific reactivity. So we have a name that we use for that, and then we look for those functional groups in molecules, because molecules that have the same functional groups tend to have the same chemical reactivity. So on the flip side of the sheet that told us how to draw molecules, we have what I made up for you guys in terms of I call it a decision tree to figure out what different functional groups we might have that are present. So again, starting up in the upper right left-hand corner here, you'll just ask yourself yes or no questions about certain things within your molecule to see if you have certain functional groups. An important point to remember is you can have more than one functional group in a molecule. So you won't necessarily go through this sheet only once for each molecule. But we're going to start with this sample problem and just identify the functional groups that are there. So again, anytime you see one of these fancy looking rings, this is an aromatic functional group. And remember that that aromatic functional group might look like this, where it kind of looks like a nut that you might see in a tool set, and that's chemically equivalent to something that has 3 double bonds in it. Note that it's not the same as a 6-membered ring that just has 1 or even 2 double bonds in it. That's not the same. You have to have all 3 looking like this in order to call it aromatic. Up here on top here, and make sure when you're circling all the atoms that are part of that functional group. This is a carboxylic acid functional group. And one thing to remember too, and we'll learn about acids and bases and pH in a few chapters, but when we see this, depending on the pH that your environment is in, you might deprotonate this carboxylic acid and it looks like this. We actually call it a carboxylate if it's shown in that form, that deprotonated form, but these are both forms of essentially the same functional group. This just changes whether it has its proton or not based on the pH. The last functional group that we have here is an ester. And there's lots of carbonyl containing functional groups. There's 5 that we're going to be looking at. And so carbonyl by itself is not a functional group. You have to look at what's next door and determine whether or not it's an aldehyde, ketone, amide, carboxylic acid, again, or carboxylate, or an ester. So in this case, we have an oxygen atom next door, which makes it an ester. So those are the 3 functional groups present on this first molecule. Second molecule, we have another aromatic. The next is an alcohol functional group. And as we learned in class, alcohols can be defined as primary, secondary, or tertiary. So to figure out if it's primary or secondary or tertiary, you have to look at the carbon that's attached to the alcohol functional group and ask, how many carbons are you connected to? This carbon is connected to 2 other carbon atoms, which makes this a secondary alcohol. We also have an amine functional group. And so for this amine functional group, we can also classify that as primary, secondary, or tertiary. But the classification is a little bit different for amines. And again, I'm going to review for alcohols. We look at the carbon that's attached to the alcohol functional group, and we ask how many carbons you're attached to. There's 1, 2 in this case. For amines, we ask how many carbons are directly attached to the nitrogen atom. In this case, there's 1, 2, which means this is a secondary amine. So make sure that you can differentiate how to classify primary, secondary, and tertiary alcohols versus primary, secondary, tertiary amines. The last molecule here has 3 functional groups as well. Again, when we have a carbonyl that is just between 2 carbon atoms, that's going to be a ketone. When we have a halogen, and this again could be fluorine, chlorine, bromine, or iodine attached to a carbon atom, we call this a haloalkane, or sometimes referred to as an alkyl halide. And then our last functional group here is an alkene, doubly bonded carbon atoms. And remember, having something like a 6-membered ring, if there's only 1 or 2 double bonds, that does not make it an aromatic ring. You have to have all 3 double bonds in order to make it an aromatic functional group.